When bikers wrecked a car, unaware that its owner was none other than Keanu Reeves, fate had an unbelievable twist in store. The Polaroid trembled between Eliza's fingers as she stood at the edge of Lake Chelan, its pristine waters reflecting the sunset in violent oranges and reds. Behind her, the cabin door slammed shut as Keanu emerged, his face a mask of confusion that quickly dissolved into horror when he saw what she held. "Where did you find that?" His voice cracked, barely audible above the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. Eliza didn't turn. Her gaze remained fixed on the photograph, a teenage boy with Keanu's eyes, standing beside a woman she didn't recognize. On the back, in faded blue ink, "James, 16, our son." 30 years of marriage, she whispered, "and I never knew you had a child." Keanu took a hesitant step forward, hands outstretched. "Eliza, please." "Who was he to you?" The question hung between them like smoke. "Who was I to you, if not someone you could trust with this?" Suddenly, the tranquil evening felt suffocating. Decades of shared memories crashed through Eliza's mind, now tainted with doubt. Every anniversary, every whispered promise of no secrets between us, all of it fractured by the weight of the photograph in her hand. "He would be 42 now," Keanu said, his voice hollow. "If he were alive." The word alive hit Eliza like physical pain. Her legs weakened and she sank to her knees on the rocky shore, still clutching the photograph as if it might dissolve if she loosened her grip. "I need you to leave," she managed, voice steady despite the earthquake inside her chest. "So you don't understand? I said leave." The shout tore from her throat, echoing across the water. A flock of birds scattered from a nearby tree, their wings beating a frantic rhythm that matched her heart. Keanu stood frozen, the orange light of sunset carving deep shadows across his face. For a moment, Eliza glimpsed something haunted in his eyes, a grief so profound it seemed to age him before her. Then he turned and walked back toward the cabin, shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. When the cabin door closed behind him, Eliza finally allowed herself to break. The tears came silently at first, then in heaving sobs that shook her entire body. The photograph blurred in her vision as she stared at the boy who should have been her stepson, a ghost she never knew existed until now. On the back of the Polaroid beneath the faded blue ink, she noticed something else, a date. Exactly 1 year before she and Keanu had met. 1 year between whatever tragedy had happened to this boy and the beginning of their life together. Eliza tucked the photograph into her pocket and stood on shaking legs. Whatever Keanu was packing, in the cabin, whatever explanation he was preparing, she wasn't ready to hear it. Not yet. She needed to find her own answers first. 27 years earlier. The emergency room buzzed with fluorescent efficiency as Keanu stared at the thin curtains separating him from the worst day of his life. Behind it, doctors worked frantically to stabilize his 16-year-old son, James, found unconscious at the bottom of a ravine, with alcohol and prescription pills in his system. "Mr. Reeves," a nurse touched his shoulder, her face etched with practiced sympathy. "Your wife is asking for you." Keanu nodded numbly, following her to another curtained area where Diane lay, her face pale but free of the lacerations that covered James. She'd been driving when they'd gone off the road, a sharp curve, wet pavement, and possibly her own intoxication combining into catastrophe. "He jumped out," Diane whispered when they were alone. "God, Keanu. He opened the door and jumped while I was driving." The words didn't make sense at first. Keanu stared at his estranged wife, trying to process what she was saying. "We were arguing about the divorce," she continued, tears streaming down her face. "About him moving in with you. He was screaming that he hated both of us, and then," she closed her eyes, "he just opened the door and jumped. I tried to grab him and the car went off the road." Keanu couldn't breathe. 6 months of bitter divorce proceedings had culminated in James finally agreeing to live with him instead of Diane. They were supposed to move his things the following weekend. "Start fresh. Did you tell the doctors?" Keanu asked. Diane shook her head, panic flashing in her eyes. "They'll say it was a suicide attempt. They'll blame us, me. They'll say I was an unfit mother. You were, Keanu thought but didn't say. Instead, he collapsed into the chair beside her bed, head in his hands. What did you tell them? That we swerved to avoid a deer. Her voice hardened. Please, Keanu. After everything, don't do this to me. Before he could respond, the curtain parted and a doctor entered, his expression grim in a way that made Keanu's heart stop. Mr. and Mrs. Reeves, I'm very sorry. What followed was a blur of clinical terms that all meant the same thing. James was gone. Internal bleeding, head trauma, nothing they could do. In that moment, as his world imploded around him, Keanu made a decision that would haunt him for decades. He said nothing about Diane's confession. He let the accident report reflect her story. A tragic collision with a deer on a rainy night. A grieving mother who'd lost control of her vehicle trying to save her son. The truth that James had chosen to end his life rather than endure his parents' toxic battle remained sealed between Keanu and Diane like a pact with the devil. 3 days after the funeral, Keanu quit his job, sold his house, and moved across the country to Seattle. He left behind everything that reminded him of James, including the truth. He told himself it was to escape the pain, but deep down, he knew it was to escape the guilt. 1 year later, at a coffee shop on a rainy Seattle morning, he met Eliza, bright, compassionate Eliza, who saw something worth saving in his broken eyes, and he'd been running from his past ever since. Eliza drove aimlessly along the lake, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles blanched white. The truck she'd borrowed from the rental agency rumbled beneath her, its unfamiliar vibrations matching her internal tremors. Her phone buzzed again, the 5th call from Keanu in the past hour. She silenced it without looking. A green highway sign announced Brewster, 8 miles. The name sparked a memory. In the Polaroid, there had been a small patch sewn onto James's jacket, Brewster High School. Before she could second-guess herself, Eliza took the exit. The town was small enough that she found the high school easily, its brick facade weathered but well-maintained. School was out for summer, but the administrative office remained open, a lone fluorescent light visible through windows decorated with faded school spirit posters. Can I help you? The woman behind the desk. Ms. Patterson, administrative, assistant according to her nameplate, looked up with professional curiosity. Eliza hesitated, suddenly aware of how strange her request might sound. I'm researching my husband's family history. His son attended school here in the 1990s. James Reeves. The name felt foreign on her tongue. Ms. Patterson's expression shifted subtly. Reeves, she repeated. That's a name I haven't heard in years. Something in her tone made Eliza's pulse quicken. You remember him? Small town, Ms. Patterson said with a sad smile. And some stories stick with you, especially the tragic ones. Eliza's throat tightened. Could you tell me what happened, please? The woman studied her for a long moment, then sighed. The yearbook room is down the hall. Second door on the left. 1996 through 1998 should be on the 3rd shelf. That'll tell you more than I could. 20 minutes later, Eliza sat alone among dusty yearbooks, staring at a memorial page from 1997. James Reeves's school portrait smiled up at her, dark hair falling across his forehead, the same deep-set eyes as Keanu, but with a guarded quality that hinted at inner turmoil. The tribute was brief, in loving memory of James Reeves, 1981-1997, forever in our hearts. Below it, a poem about stars and angels that offered no clue about how he died. But it was the signatures scrawled around the page that told a deeper story. I wish I'd known what you were going through. Should have been there for you, man. Sorry I didn't answer your call that night. And most chillingly, your parents failed you. We all did. Eliza closed the yearbook, her suspicions crystallizing into a terrible certainty. She needed to speak with someone who knew James, not just as a name in a memorial, but as a person. The local diner seemed like the best place to start. If small towns had one constant, it was that someone at the local gathering spot would know everyone's business. Coffee, black, she told the middle-aged waitress whose name tag read Beverly. When the woman returned with the steaming mug, Eliza took a chance. "I'm looking into some local history. Did you live here in the 90s? Beverly raised an eyebrow. "Born and raised. Why?" "I'm trying to learn about a family, the Reeves. They had a son, James." "Lord Almighty," Beverly interrupted, lowering her voice. "What's your interest in that tragedy?" "My husband," Eliza swallowed. "Keanu Reeves is my husband." Beverly's eyes widened. "He came back, after all this time?" "No, we're just visiting the area. I recently learned about James and I'm trying to understand what happened." The waitress glanced around the half-empty diner, then slid into the booth across from Eliza. "It was a terrible thing, that poor boy. Rumors flew for months afterward." She leaned closer. "They said he jumped from the car, on purpose. His mother was driving drunk again, and they went off the road near Stamen Flats." Eliza's coffee turned bitter in her mouth. "Suicide?" Beverly nodded grimly. "That's what everyone suspected, though it was ruled an accident officially. Those parents fought like cats and dogs through their divorce, used that boy as a weapon against each other." She shook her head. "Your husband packed up and disappeared after the funeral. Can't say I blamed him. And the mother, Diane, stayed about a year, drinking herself stupid every night at the roadhouse, telling anyone who'd listen it wasn't her fault. Eventually she moved to Idaho, I think. Never heard from her again." Eliza stared into her coffee, mind reeling. "Thank you," she said softly. Beverly patted her hand. "Family secrets have a way of surfacing, honey. Like bodies in a lake. No matter how deep you sink them, they always float back up." As twilight deepened into night, Eliza found herself parked at Stamen Flats, staring at the ravine where James Reeves had died 27 years earlier. Yellow police tape no longer cordoned off the area. Nature had reclaimed the scene of tragedy, wildflowers and scrub brush growing defiantly among the rocks. She'd called Keanu after leaving the diner, telling him where to meet her. Now she waited, heart hammering against her ribs, unsure whether she wanted answers or absolution. Headlights swept across the darkness as Keanu's rental car pulled up beside hers. He emerged slowly, looking older than he had that morning, grief etched into the lines of his face. They stood in silence at the edge of the ravine, the distant rush of water below the only sound between them. "He jumped," Eliza finally said. Not a question. Keanu nodded, eyes fixed on the darkness below. "Diane was drunk. They'd been fighting about moving in with me." His voice cracked. He opened the door and jumped out rather than live with either of us. The brutality of it, a child choosing death over his warring parents, stole Eliza's breath. "Why didn't you tell me? All these years?" At first, I couldn't talk about it without falling apart. Keanu ran a trembling hand through his dark hair. "Then when I met you, you were so full of life, Eliza, so untouched by that kind of darkness. I thought if I buried it deep enough, maybe I could become the person you believed I was. Instead, you became a liar." The words came out sharper than she intended. Keanu flinched. "Yes. What else don't I know about you?" He turned to face her fully. "Nothing. James was the only secret I kept. And every year on his birthday, every year on the anniversary of his death, I've come apart inside while pretending everything was fine." Eliza remembered those days, the ones when Keanu grew distant, claiming work stress or migraines. How many grief anniversaries had she missed? How many times had he mourned alone while she remained oblivious? "I found the photograph in that old tackle box in the cabin storage," she said, "along with newspaper clippings about the accident. Why bring them here to our anniversary trip?" Keanu closed his eyes. "Because I've been coming to this lake every year since it happened. In the beginning, to punish myself. Later, I don't know. To remember, maybe. This year, I wanted to finally tell you the truth. I just couldn't find the words." Eliza thought about the 3 decades they'd shared. The laughter, the struggles, the quiet moments of perfect understanding. All of it real, yet built. Upon an omission so profound it challenged everything she thought she knew about their marriage. "I can't imagine losing a child," she whispered. "But I also can't imagine shutting out the person who promised to share my life for better or worse. I know. Keanu's voice was barely audible. I've rehearsed 1,000 explanations over the years, but they all sound hollow now. I was a coward. Eliza. I was afraid you'd see me differently, as the failed father whose son chose death over life with him. The rawness of his confession hung between them. For the first time since finding the photograph, Eliza truly looked at her husband. Not the man she thought she knew, but the broken, flawed human being standing before her, finally exposed in his most vulnerable truth. "What happened to Diane?" she asked. "Breast cancer 15 years ago. She called me before she died, still insisting it wasn't her fault." His face hardened momentarily. Maybe it wasn't, maybe it was mine or both of ours. Eliza moved closer, not quite touching him, but near enough to feel his warmth in the cool night air. "I need time, Keanu. This isn't something I can process overnight." He nodded, resignation in every line of his body. "I understand. But I'm not leaving." She reached for his hand, her touch tentative but deliberate. 30 years means something. It has to. Keanu stared at their joined hands, a tear tracking silently down his weathered cheek. "I should have told you from the beginning." "Yes," Eliza agreed, "but we're here now, and maybe—" She glanced toward the ravine, then back at her husband. "Maybe it's time we both stopped running from ghosts." In the distance, the lake shimmered under starlight, constant, deep, and forgiving in its vastness. Like grief, like love, like the complicated, imperfect truth of what it means to be human. Keanu squeezed her hand, a silent acknowledgement of all that had been lost and all that might still be saved. Together they stood at the edge of the past, facing whatever uncertain future awaited them on the other side of truth.